The ring struck Anservia's collarbone with a faint shrill clink, then bounced onto the carpet and rolled into a pool of spilled red wine. The crimson liquid instantly swallowed the cold gleam of the platinum ring, as if some ancient, bloody sacrificial ritual had finally struck its final note. Anservia did not bend down to pick it up. It wasn't that she didn't want to. She was simply frozen in place. Her emerald eyes were wide with shock, her pupils still reflecting the silvery trail the ring had left as it flew toward her. A vivid red mark quickly bloomed on the skin, where it had struck her collarbone, standing out against her ivory, white complexion, as if seared by a hot iron. The entire ballroom fell deathly silent. 300 people, imperial nobles, ministers, royal representatives, and envoys from neighboring nations, all dressed in their most expensive evening gowns, adorned with heirloom jewels and holding crystal flutes, froze in place. The fine bubbles of champagne continued to burst one by one against the sides of the glasses, emitting an extremely faint sound, like a final gasp before death. I stood on the 17th step of the spiral staircase. My left hand remained in the position of having just flung the ring, fingers slightly splayed, suspended in midair. The faint white indentation left by the ring on my ring finger was still clearly visible. For 3 years, that ring had felt as if it had grown into my flesh, reminding me day and night whose woman I was, whose property, whose prisoner. Now it was gone. The spot felt as empty as a fresh wound. The chilly evening breeze swept in from some corner of the ballroom, blowing against that circle of bare skin. I felt the sting and a sense of relief. Then, Lucian Ashburn moved. He didn't walk over. He tore his way through the crowd. I didn't even have time to see his movements, clearly before his towering figure had already charged to the bottom of the stairs, crushing at least 3 overturned crystal glasses. The shards crackled harshly beneath his feet as the soles of his leather shoes ground over the glass shards, over the spilled champagne, over the wine-soaked stain on the carpet, where the ring lay at the bottom of that pool of liquid like a heart buried in mud. He looked up at me. His eyes were red, not the cloudy red of drunkenness, but a bloodthirsty, agonized red, the kind that comes when one's sanity is snapping, strand by strand. Those eyes, once hailed as the Empire's most composed dark brown pupils, were now contracting violently. An unnatural flush flushed his cheekbones, and his Adam's apple bobbed frantically, as if something were struggling to break free from his throat, to scream, to roar, to bite through my neck. "You," he began, his voice hoarse as if a rusty knife were scraping against stone. "Went to her. I asked her. I asked Anservia, isn't she, in your eyes, just a flower that needs to be cradled in the palm of your hand? Did my blow knock her petals off?" "Lucian." Anservia suddenly spoke up, clutching her collarbone. She staggered back a step. The hem of her deep red evening gown was soaked with a large patch of red wine from the floor, the color growing richer and darker, like congealed blood. Her eyes were brimming with tears, her nose reddened, her lips trembling. Her voice was soft and faint, yet clear enough for everyone present to hear distinctly. "It hurts, Lucian. It hurts so much. It hurts so much." She had been struck on the collarbone by a ring whose edges had been polished smooth and rounded, and she cried out in pain. "And what of me? I've been married into Ashburn Manor for 3 years, tortured by his indifference for a full 1,095 days and nights, standing in the corner with a forced smile whenever he and his mistress appeared arm in arm at every public event, on every late night when he was drunk and called out the wrong name. I'd untie his tie and wipe the lipstick smudges from his face, amidst the whispers in aristocratic circles of 'look at that poor stand.' In Bride, I'd lower my head and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. From head to toe, inside and out, every inch of my bones ached. But when, have I ever cried out in pain? When have I ever cried, thrown a tantrum, smashed things, or grabbed him by the collar to demand, have you ever even treated me like a human being? Never. Not once. Because I didn't dare. Because I am the daughter of a fallen baron. Because I am the social climber his family casually took under their wing. Because what my father owes the Ashburn family isn't money, it's a life. From the very beginning, I had no right to speak with my head held high in this marriage. I could only kneel before those rules and contracts inlaid with gold and silver, kneel at the feet of his indifference and his white moonlight, kneel until my knees were shattered without daring to utter a sound. But tonight, I stood up. Lucien looked at me. He looked at me, his eyes churning with emotions I couldn't decipher, anger, shock, confusion, and a hint of something that could almost be classified as fear. Fear. What could he possibly be afraid of? Afraid of losing me? The thought flashed through my mind for less than half a second before I quashed it. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control. The orderly, quiet, trouble-free Duchess who had been under his control for 3 years had suddenly overturned the table, and he could no longer keep her in check. And the one thing Lucien Ashburn hated most was losing control. Get down. His voice had changed, no longer hoarse, no longer uncontrolled. He'd forced it back down into that cold, hard, commanding bass he was so accustomed to, the tone that required not the slightest effort when speaking to me on the battlefield, in the court, or at home. He thought I was still that Isabella who would obediently come down. I smiled. The curve of my lips was faint, but I was certain he saw it, because I saw his dark brown pupils contract sharply, as if pricked by a needle. I didn't go down. I lifted the hem of my skirt and walked down the last few steps. The sound of my high heels striking the marble was steady and crisp, each step like a full stop. I walked past him without stopping, without turning my head to meet his gaze, and headed straight for Ancelia. The crowd automatically parted to make way for me, or rather, they automatically stepped back, because no one wanted to get dragged into this. This was the Duke of Ashburn's family affair, a three-way power struggle where anyone who got involved was bound to suffer. They wanted to watch the show, but they didn't want to be on stage. And Saria watched me approach, took half a step back, and clenched her fingers tighter around her collarbone. Her tears were already streaming down, tracing the most perfect path across the most perfect cheek, at the most perfect cheek at the most perfect moment. She was a beauty. She had always been a beauty, from childhood to adulthood, inside and out. Every pore precisely calculated when to cry, when to laugh, when to show weakness, and when to strike. She said softly, "Madam, I know you hate me. I'll step down. I'll step down right now. Please don't hurt yourself anymore, and don't hurt Lucien either." Hurt myself. She was implying to everyone that I'd thrown the ring because I'd gone mad with jealousy, that I was self-harming, that I was using this undignified, inelegant, and utterly disgraceful method to the aristocratic family's reputation to seek my husband's attention. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. For 3 years, I've been left speechless every single time by her tactics. Words that appear to be a concession, but are actually an attack. Each time, under her pitiful gaze, I've been forced into the role of an immature, petty, unworthy of being a duchess shrew. But tonight, it didn't work. I raised my hand, pinched the cuff of my glove between 2 fingers, and slowly, inch by inch, slipped the long glove off my right hand. The silk satin made a faint rustling sound as it parted from my skin, revealing a hideous scar beneath that stretched from my wrist to my forearm. It was left 3 months ago. That night, he went to see her. I was alone in the manor with a high fever that wouldn't break. When I fainted, I fell onto the cast iron railing of the fireplace, gouging a nearly 20-centimeter long gash in my arm and leaving a pool of blood on the floor. The butler found me later and carried me to the infirmary, where I received 13 stitches. I lay in bed for 4 days. When he returned, he glanced at me, asked, "How did that happen?" Then took the call from Inservia and turned to go to his study. I don't know why I chose to reveal this scar tonight. Perhaps I wanted everyone to see it, or perhaps I simply didn't want to hide it anymore. I've hidden too many things for 3 years. So many that I've almost forgotten what I truly look like. And Servia's gaze fell on the scar. Her lips tightened, and a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile, one only eye standing so close, could catch, flashed across her pitifully innocent face. She was gloating, and, in the very next second, Lucian spun around abruptly and grabbed the nearly 2-meter-tall champagne tower. 300 crystal glasses, stacked into a pagoda shape, each tier filled to the brim with golden champagne. It was the centerpiece of tonight's banquet, and a tradition upheld at Ashburn Manor for 80 years. Every year, on the first anniversary of her marriage, the new Duchess was required to personally fill it at the anniversary dinner, symbolizing the family's prosperity shall never topple. I didn't fill it. That year was my first as a newlywed. I stood before the tower, holding the champagne bottle, my palms drenched in sweat. I waited for him to walk over, stand beside me, and like the husbands of other women, steady the bottle's neck for me, whispering, "Don't be nervous." Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw his back. He was walking toward Inservia, taking her by the hand to lead her onto the dance floor. I filled that tower all by myself, my hands shaking so much that half of it spilled. Tonight, he destroyed it with his own hands. Lucian Ashburn clenched his fist around the tower's stainless steel frame, the muscles in his shoulders straining beneath his black tuxedo, until they seemed ready to tear the fabric apart. He roared, not with words, but with a primal sound, the howl of a cornered beast, mingled with shattering crystal, splashing wine, and the screams of the entire room. The sound of 300 crystal glasses, shattering simultaneously, felt as though the ceiling of the entire ballroom had collapsed. Glass shards and champagne sprayed out like an explosion. Several large shards flew several meters away, embedding themselves in the oil painting on the wall and slicing the former Duke's face in two. Champagne drenched the guests in the front row. The ladies screamed and scrambled backward, while the gentlemen shielded them as they staggered back. Chairs toppled, tables were knocked askew, and the dessert table was jostled until it teetered on the brink of collapse. He wasn't done yet. After smashing the tower, he turned and overturned the 2-meter-long dessert table. French macarons, white chocolate mousse, caramel pudding, raspberry mill, fuel, dozens of desserts, along with their silver trays and bone china cutlery, crashed to the floor. Cream and jam splattered onto the wallpaper and onto the hems of the guests' dresses and trousers. A silver 3-tiered dessert stand flew through the air, nearly striking the Minister of Finance on the head, but his wife screamed and pulled him out of the way. Lucian Ashburn. His mother, Lady Adeline, pushed her way through the crowd, her cane thudding against the floor. Her well-preserved face was etched with fear and anger. "Have you lost your mind? Look at yourself. Look at the state you're in. In this condition, your father is watching from heaven." Lucian didn't answer. He didn't even look at his mother. He grabbed the largest oil painting on the wall, the portrait of the Ashburn family's founder, the first Grand Duke, the man of legend who had personally beheaded the king of a rival nation, and yanked it violently from the wall. The frame crashed to the floor, the gilded edges snapping into 4 pieces. The sound of the canvas tearing, like flesh being ripped apart, pierced through all the screams. He turned around, his deep golden hair disheveled. 2 buttons on his shirt popped open, revealing an old scar on his collarbone. His chest heaved violently, his breathing heavy and ragged, as if he were sprinting, as if fleeing for his life, as if something were clenched around his throat choking him. His eyes were so red they seemed ready to bleed. but the light within them was no longer uncontrolled rage. It was something sharper, more desperate. He looked at me. He was hoping I would stop him, hoping I would scream, hoping I would cry, hoping I would rush forward to grab his hand and say, enough to say, I'm still here. I didn't. I stood there, not moving an inch. The scar on my arm was exposed to everyone's gaze, ugly, menacing, like a dried-up river crawling across my pale skin. That smile still hung on my lips, that faint polite smile almost cruel in its politeness. When he saw that smile, the last trace of color drained from his face. Are you satisfied now? His voice was soft, so soft it sounded like the last breath squeezed from beneath the rubble. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Everyone was watching me. 300 pairs of eyes, some filled with fear, some with loathing, some merely watching the spectacle, and some with sympathy they dared not show. I looked at the man standing in the center of the ruins. My husband, the Duke of Ashburn, the proudest man in the empire, who now resembled a wolf trapped in an iron cage, its head bloodied from ramming against the bars. I nodded, satisfied. He froze for a moment. It lasted only a fraction of a second. But I caught it. He looked as though he'd been slapped in the face. His towering frame wavered, and his feet crushed shards of glass beneath him, producing a grating sound. Then I turned away. I lifted the hem of my skirt, stepping around the stain, a mixture of red wine, champagne, and strawberry syrup, the color of blood, around the torn portrait of the first Grand Duke lying on the floor, and around the trembling Anservia. The red mark on her collarbone had faded, but her makeup was smeared by the spilled champagne, her honey-colored hair clinging wetly to her cheeks. No longer perfect. For the first time, she looked not pitiful, but disheveled. I kept walking. The sound of my high heels on the gravel and shards of crystal gradually became monotonous and clear, like the final drumbeat of some ritual. Footsteps sounded behind me, heavy, hurried, and brutally closing in. Lucian's voice sounded as if he'd squeezed every last ounce of strength from his body, forced through clenched teeth, hoarse beyond recognition, trembling so much it barely sounded like him. Isabella, if you step through that door tonight, I'll never look for you again. Remember this, how your family begged to crawl through the doors of my Ashburn household. Your father doesn't owe me money. You know that better than anyone, damn it. My hand was already pressed against the heavy, carved oak door of the ballroom. The wood was cold, its carvings etched deeply into my palm, like those marks carved into my bones that I've never been able to shake off. I didn't turn around. My voice was soft, cutting through the chaos and the silence of 300 people. Yet it rang clear in every ear. That's right. My father traded my life for this marriage. I pressed my hand against the door, forcing it open a crack. The night wind rushed in, carrying the scent of the rose garden outside, the scent of freedom. But Lucian, I've already died once. The person I am now owes nothing to anyone. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing off that world steeped in anger, power, and the stench of conspiracy. I stood on the stone steps, the November chill piercing through my champagne-colored silk dress. My whole body was trembling, not from the cold, but because the breath I'd held for so long had finally been released. Tears began to fall. One after another, they were as hot as blood fresh from my heart, spilling over the corners of my mouth, still turned up, though not quite closed. After 3 years as a prisoner, tonight, I stepped out of my cage. Even if a cliff lies beyond the cage, I will not look back. The carriage jolted on the gravel road. As the wheels rolled over a loose pebble, the entire carriage swayed before settling back into a steady rhythm. I pressed my forehead against the cool window pane, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of horseshoes clattering against the pavement, each beat reverberating deep into my bones. It was November. The late autumn night wind seeped through the cracks in the window, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and the acrid smell of fallen leaves burning at some distant estate. I was still wearing that champagne-colored silk evening gown. The pearls at the neckline trembled gently in the breeze, tapping against my collarbone again and again, like some tireless, gentle torture. I hadn't changed. When I walked out of the ballroom, I carried nothing, not even a coat. The butler's face flashed across my peripheral vision. The moment I pushed open the door, old Andrew, who had been in this house for 40 years, watching me marry into it, watching me be neglected, watching me wipe away my tears in the hallway before returning to the ballroom with a smile. He opened his mouth, as if to say something. Perhaps, madam, would you like a shawl? But I had already stepped out into the wind. A shawl, gloves, a ring, a title, a husband, a home. I left everything behind that door. The carriage rounded a bend, and the final wrought iron gate of Ashbourne Manor shrank into a tiny black silhouette in the mirror, like window. I opened my eyes and watched through the glass as it grew smaller and smaller, watching the flag embroidered with the Ashbourne coat of arms flutter in the night wind. A golden eagle clutching a sword and 3 roses in its talons. How tightly that eagle clutched them, just as tightly as the hand that once held that ring. Then, the flag vanished from view. I leaned back in my seat, feeling that I ought to cry, to wail, to pour out 3 years of pent-up sorrow and flood this carriage with it. But my eyes were dry. Those scorching tears I'd shed on the stone steps a moment ago seemed to have drained every last drop of moisture from me. Now all that remained was exhaustion. Overwhelming, all-encompassing exhaustion, like a giant sponge that had sucked me whole into its depths. I turned my hand over, palm facing up, and looked at the faint white ring mark on my ring finger. 3 years. The ring had been on my finger for 3 years. The mark was so deep, it looked as if it had been carved there. The skin was slightly indented at that spot, and the blood vessels around it seemed to have been forced to take a detour. I tried rubbing the mark with my thumb, but the skin felt numb and tingly. I felt nothing. Perhaps it would never fade in this lifetime. Perhaps it was never meant to fade. I had thrown it away with my own hands. Yet the mark it left would forever pin those days to my hand. Madam. The coachman's voice came from the small window up front, aged and cautious. There's a fork in the road ahead. To the left is the way to the city. To the right is the way to your father's old home. Which way would you like to go? My father's former residence. I let the words roll around on my tongue. My father's former residence. When these words came together, it felt as though someone were slicing open a wound that hadn't yet healed with a dull knife. It had been a year since my father passed away. That old house, that dilapidated, ivy-covered former baronial mansion, where even the stone steps at the front entrance were on the verge of collapsing from the rain, was now uninhabited. Perhaps it had been repossessed by the bank, perhaps it still stood empty, or perhaps it had long since been taken over by stray cats and dust. But it had once been the only place I was ever allowed to call home. To the right, I said. The voice that emerged from my throat was hoarse and unrecognizable, as if it had been sanded down. The coachman gave a nod, and the carriage jolted as it turned onto the narrower, more dilapidated side road. It had been 3 years since I'd last traveled this path. Since marrying into Ashbourne Manor, I hadn't returned even once, not because I didn't want to, but because Lucian wouldn't allow it. What would a member of the Ashbourne family be doing in a place like that? He said this on the 3rd day after our wedding. I was standing in the manor's rose garden, my finger still adorned with the wedding ring that had just been slipped on, a ring I wasn't quite used to yet, and with a touch of naive hope in my heart, I asked if he would accompany me back to my hometown. I wanted to retrieve some mementos left behind by my mother. He stood 3 meters away, his back to me, pruning a white rosebush. He didn't even turn his head when he said it. It wasn't that he didn't know he'd said something wrong. It was that he simply didn't care what expression was on my face. I never brought it up again. The carriage jolted even more violently. The roads in the city had been repaired at the Ashburn family's expense. They were so smooth there wasn't a single pothole to be found. But this road leading to the old estate in the north had been neglected for a long time. The surface was pitted and uneven, littered with dead branches and broken stones. On either side stood dense groves of black pine. Moonlight filtered through the gaps in the canopy, scattering across the ground like a shower of silver. I clenched my own hand. The empty ring on my ring finger looked particularly jarring in the moonlight, as if some invisible ring were still there, continuing to bind me in a way that didn't exist. Suddenly, a scattering of lights flashed past the car window. Not a manor, but a village. It was the north, the countryside where I had run as a child, whose familiar smells and colors were beginning to fade from my memory. The scent of pine resin, the smoke of burning firewood, the warm, musty smell drifting from a distant cattle shed. It all poured in through the cracks in the car window, violently filling my nostrils. I instinctively took a deep breath, then froze. I was smelling these things. For 3 years, I had been allowed to smell only the white roses in the rose garden, the rose perfume on Anservia, the ceaseless scent of beeswax and lemon in the manor's hallways, and the chaotic mix of whiskey and her scent on Lucian when he returned late at night. My nose had been tamed by those elegant, expensive, aristocratic scents. I had forgotten what pine resin smelled like, forgotten what earth smelled like, forgotten what the air of freedom smelled like. Tears suddenly welled up without warning. Not the scalding, agonizing tears from earlier on the stone steps, but a slow, aching warmth seeping from the very marrow of my bones. I clenched my teeth and held them back. I must not cry. It is not yet time to cry. The carriage finally came to a stop. The horse's hooves scraped twice against the gravel. It snorted, and then the whole world fell silent, leaving only the rustling of the night wind through the trees and a deeper quiet hum. I didn't know what it was, perhaps tinnitus, or perhaps it was simply too quiet. So quiet that my ears began to create sounds on their own to fill the void. I pushed open the carriage door without waiting for the coachman to help me. The moment my high heels touched the ground, a dull pain shot through my ankle. I looked down to see that I'd stepped on a flagstone half, buried in the dirt. Engraved on it was a faint, blurred letter. Bell, eroded by decades of rain and moss. That was my surname, a boundary marker for the Bella estate, engraved with the family's initial, now nearly swallowed whole by the earth. I bent down and brushed aside the dry grass and wet mud beside it, revealing more of the engraving beneath. Bell Manor. Bell Manor. Manor. What a grand-sounding word. In reality, it was just an old house built 3.5 centuries ago. A 2-story building with drab limestone walls covered in ivy, 7 or 8 missing roof tiles, and a chimney on the east side that had collapsed halfway during that great storm. Father hadn't bothered to repair it, saying that the fireplace wasn't used anyway. Father. He always wore an old tweed jacket, the elbows worn shiny, his voice rough, his palms covered in calluses. When he smiled, his whole face crumpled like crumpled craft paper. He had once been a junior officer in the Imperial Army. The fact that he'd been granted a baron's title was ancient history. In my grandfather's day, there had been hundreds of acres of fertile land. By the time it came to him, all that remained was this old mansion and a mountain of debt he could never pay off. And then, he married me off. He begged, on his knees. To this day, I don't know all the details of that deal. I only remember that day when the Ashburn carriage pulled up on this rutted road for the first time, and the old Duke Lucian's father stepped out and walked into our small parlor, where the carpet had been worn down to the backing. He brought a document written on parchment, his lawyer and his eldest son. Lucian was 24 that year, wearing a black trench coat and white gloves. So handsome he didn't seem real. He never once met my eyes. He just stood by the window, staring expressionlessly at the old oak tree outside, half eaten away by insects. Father knelt on the floor to thank the old Duke for his kindness. He knelt on the floor. I did not kneel. I stood behind Father, clutching my skirt, without uttering a single word from start to finish. The old Duke glanced at me. A flicker of satisfaction passed through his cloudy yet shrewd gray eyes. Then he turned to Father and said, "The agreed-upon terms remain unchanged." What terms? What exactly did Father owe the Ashburns? I'd asked him countless times, but Father always gave the same answer. "I've found you a good home, Isa. Don't ask so many questions." Yet I could clearly see that every time he said those words, his eyes were red. The old Duke died the year after the marriage contract was signed. A sudden heart attack. He died in an armchair in his study. Father passed away 3 months ago as well. The two people who knew the truth are now both buried beneath the earth, taking that secret with them forever. I pushed open the iron gate of the old mansion. The hinges were rusted solid, emitting a sharp, baby-like wail. Moonlight fell on the overgrown weeds in the front yard. They stood half a person's height and undulated like ocean waves in the breeze. The moss on the stone steps was treacherously slippery. I braced myself against the cracked wall beside me and climbed step by step. With every contact between my high heels and the marble steps, a lonely echo rang out, as if the empty house were tapping to confirm, "Simone has returned." The front door was locked. The lock was rusted. I pulled the pearl hairpin from my hair and jiggled it in the keyhole a couple of times. It was a skill I hadn't used in years, back when I used to sneak into my father's study as a child to steal licorice candies. The sound of the latch springing open was rougher and more unpleasant than I remembered, but it gave way. As I pushed the door open, a smell of mold mixed with dust hit me like the first breath exhaled by an old man who'd been asleep for years. Moonlight streamed through the doorway, illuminating the thick layer of dust on the entryway floor, the tapestry on the wall riddled with holes from insect damage, and the withered, yellowed ivy winding around the banister. It wasn't dead. It had merely been sleeping, and I had returned. The moment I stepped over the threshold, the blank ring mark on my finger suddenly throbbed with pain. A sudden needle-like sting, as if something had been activated in that instant. I looked down at my hand. There was nothing there. It was still blank, clean, empty. Yet, it was hurting. The sound of the wind outside suddenly changed its tune. Amidst the howling through the pine forest, there seemed to be a distant, indistinct cry. I wasn't sure if it was a hallucination, or the wind, or a cow bellowing from some farmhouse in the distance, but it sounded too much like a human voice, like Lucian, calling my name. I didn't turn around. I walked into that darkness and dust, into the only place left that truly belonged to me. Behind me, the door closed slowly, shutting out the sound of the wind, shutting out the moonlight, shutting out that gilded cage, a place I'd walked through for 3 years yet had never truly belonged to me. The key sank into the palm of my hand, its teeth digging into my flesh, the cold metal warming slightly where it touched my skin. I didn't stand up. I just crouched in front of the bookshelf, crouched in the dust that had accumulated over 3 years, my fingers clenching the black iron key so tightly my fingernails turned white. The snake biting its own tail was engraved on the key's handle, etching a perfect circle into the palm of my hand. The Ouroboros infinity, eternity, a lifelong contract, irrevocable. My mind was racing so fast. My temples were throbbing. Father had hidden it under the bookshelf, not just shoved there haphazardly, but placed in the narrow gap between the floor and the base of the shelf, hidden for who knows how many years. Only he and I had ever lived in this old house. The servants were all dismissed the year Mother died. When he hid that key, I was probably asleep upstairs, or in the kitchen reheating that pot of bean soup that never seemed to run out, or in the garden pulling up withered roses one by one. He stood alone in the study, hunched over, pushing the key into the deepest, darkest corner beneath the bookshelf. Then he straightened up, brushed the dust from his hands, sat back down in that armchair, and continued with his bookkeeping. He never mentioned a word about it. Not in his final letter. Not in that "don't hate me" he said as he left. Not in his will either, if those few scribbled lines on the back of a bill, written without even a notary, could be called a will. He didn't know he'd die so soon. But he knew this key would be found, sooner or later. I slowly stood up. My knees cracked. I'd been crouching too long, my joints stiff as two rusty hinges. I didn't brush the dust off my skirt. I walked straight to the desk in the center of the study, rounded the corner, and approached the row of old filing cabinets against the wall. 5 drawers, all locked with uniform brass locks. 10 years ago, I'd pried open every one of these drawers, stealing licorice, stealing the old photos of mother that father had hidden away, stealing that diagnosis slip-marked terminal cancer, 6 months to live, that I'd pulled out and then slipped back in. I didn't have this key back then. This key isn't for opening those drawers. I crouched down and pulled open the bottom drawer. It wasn't locked, because I'd already broken the lock. Inside were yellowed old bills, binding cord, and a few fountain pens with rusty nibs. I reached in, pushing aside the clutter, and felt the partition at the very bottom of the drawer. It was made of wood, with a few small holes from woodworm, and sounded hollow when tapped. I dug my fingernail into the crack along the edge of the partition, gave it a hard tug, and it popped open with a click, revealing a narrow, dark compartment beneath, and a pitch-black keyhole right in the center of it. It was right here, hidden in the secret compartment of the drawer. I'd rummaged through 1,000 times as a child, concealed behind a thin wooden panel. It had been hiding right under my nose for a full 10 years. My hands were shaking. The key scraped against the edge of the keyhole twice before I got it aligned. I inserted it and turned it clockwise. The lock turned with a dull, heavy resistance, as if it were filled with rust and dust, creaking with every inch of rotation. After nearly a full turn, there was a click and the lock opened. A stack of letters lay in the secret compartment. It wasn't a thick stack. 7 or 8 letters. The envelopes were made of dark brown craft paper, their edges frayed. The addresses and recipients' names were written in blue ink with a broad-nibbed pen. The handwriting was bold and scrawled. No, it wasn't my father's. My father's handwriting was smaller and finer, as if he were conserving ink with every stroke. This handwriting belonged to someone else. The pressure was so fierce that I could feel indentations on the back of the paper. The envelope of the first letter read, "To His Excellency Baron Bella, to be opened by him only." The return address, headquarters of the Imperial Northern Frontier Military District. Northern Frontier Military District. I quickly skimmed through the remaining letters. Every single one had the same sender, headquarters of the Northern Frontier Military District. The recipient was always my father. The dates ranged from 18 years ago to 13 years ago, spanning exactly 5 years. The last letter was dated 3 months after my mother's death. 18 years ago. I wasn't even born yet. 13 years ago. I was 5. I pulled out the earliest letter. I tore open the seal with too much force, and the edge of the paper cut into the pad of my index finger. A thin trickle of blood seeped out, staining the corner of the page. I ignored it. The letter was written on official Imperial Ministry of War stationery, bearing a coat of arms featuring a sword and 3 stars at the top. The body of the text took up only half a page, but by the 3rd line, I felt as though the floor beneath my feet was sinking. The content was simple. The Northern Military District had requisitioned a border forest plot owned by Baron Bella during wartime to construct a temporary munitions depot, promising compensation at 3 times the market price after the war. The signature at the bottom bore a name and the ministry's official seal, Colonel Ashburn. Colonel Ashburn. Lucian's father, the old Duke Ashburn. I tore open the 2nd letter, the 3rd, the 4th, reading them one after another. By the end, my fingers were covered in blood and paper shreds. Taken together, the letters painted a picture of a meticulously orchestrated hunt. The requisition of the woodland was merely the beginning. Under the guise of military logistics, the old Duke kept raising the stakes: transportation routes, supply depots, warehouse expansions, land use extensions. And with each new demand, the compensation doubled. Father signed countless consent forms. Those documents likely still lie in some locked filing cabinet, exuding the musty scent of aged paper, each item bearing a line of fine print. Should Party B be unable to repay, all assets under its name and custody of future descendants shall be used as offset. Custody of descendants. Those words stood alone on a separate line at the end of the fifth letter, the ink unusually thick, as if the writer feared the reader might not see them clearly. My father was a poor baron. His greatest source of income throughout his life was that patch of woodland, along with a sword and a military medal left by his ancestors. After the war ended, the compensation was delayed for 3 years, yet the interest never stopped accruing for a single month. He went to demand payment, knelt before the war ministry, his knees crossing countless thresholds, until he finally knelt his way into the Ashburn family's hall. The old Duke sat before the fireplace, told him to rise, and said the debt was forgiven. Then he handed him another contract, a marriage alliance, marrying off his daughter, a contract for life. I flipped over the last letter. The back was blank, except for a line of small handwriting in the corner. My father's penmanship, lighter than any entry in his ledger, as if he had written it with his last ounce of strength. They took her blood, your mother's blood. I stared at that line, at the final stroke of the word, blood, where the pen had punched a hole through the paper. Then I stood up and slammed the key in my hand down onto the floor. The iron key clanged loudly against the floor, bounced up, struck the edge of the filing cabinet, and rolled into the corner where it came to rest. I didn't pick it up. Now I know what the old Duke said when Father knelt down. It wasn't, "I pity you." It was, "Your blood is no good. Is there anyone among your descendants who's fit for the task?" The Bella bloodline, the bloodline from my mother's side. She wasn't the daughter of an ordinary family. Father never spoke of her origins, only saying, "Your mother came from a place far, far away." After she died, everything related to her was taken away. I used to think it was because Father was too heartbroken to bear it. But now I know it was because someone feared leaving evidence behind. Her manuscripts, letters, jewelry box, every sketch she'd ever drawn. All of it was gone. What the Ashburns wanted wasn't a dowry, or the woodland estate, or that paltry compensation. What they wanted was bloodline, and I am the bearer of that bloodline. From the moment I married Lucian, my body ceased to belong to me. It is an asset still being appraised, a blood sample still being tested, a vessel stamped with the label lifetime contract. Does Lucian know? When his father, who treated people like pawns, died, did he spill the truth on his deathbed? Or was he kept in the dark too, truly believing this was just an ordinary marriage of convenience? The daughter of a penniless baron marrying above her station, repaying a debt with her body. I stood in the center of my father's study. Moonlight poured in through the window, which had no curtains, bathing me in light and splitting me in two, half in shadow, half in light. One hand was still bleeding, the other was clenched into a fist. The pine forest outside the window wailed in the wind. In the distance, a voice sounded again. This time it wasn't a hallucination, but a real, tangible sound, carrying through the layers of darkness and tree trunks. Someone was calling my name. Not Lucian's hoarse, gut-wrenching scream, but a sharper, more frenzied cry, as if some immense terror had seized hold of all reason. I say belay. The voice came from far away, torn into shreds by the forest and the night wind. Each fragment crashed against the stone walls of the old mansion, against the floor beneath my feet, and against the white scar on my ring finger, a mark that still throbbed with a dull ache. I turned, grabbed the torn ledger from the desk, and stuffed it into my bosom. Then I bent down to pick up the key tossed in the corner and clenched it in my palm. I didn't go outside. I stood where I was and read the line my father had left on the letter once more. They took her blood. I looked up at the dim, dust-covered full-length mirror by the study door. Reflected in the mirror was a woman in a soiled evening gown, barefoot, her hair disheveled, a hideous scar exposed on her arm, her hands covered in blood and ink, and a light burning in her gray, blue eyes that hadn't shone in 3 years. She no longer looked like a duchess. She looked like a knife. The sound came from the pine forest to the north. It wasn't Lucian. That realization hit me like a bucket of ice water poured over my head, snapping me instantly back to my senses. It was a woman's voice, sharp broken, as if something were chasing her and biting her ankle, and she were screaming my name with every ounce of strength she had left. And Servia. I spun around, my bare feet hitting the floor, and tiptoed silently to the window. With my back pressed against the cold wall, I turned my head and peered out through the remaining corner of the curtain. Moonlight bathed the front yard in a ghastly pallor. Weeds as tall as a person swayed wildly in the wind. The iron gate still stood at the angle. I'd left it, its rust-red hinges looking like 2 frozen bloodstains in the moonlight. She stood outside the gate. The woman who was always flawless at every party now stood with her hair in disarray in the biting late autumn wind of the north. Her honey-colored long hair was blown into a tangled mess, and the hem of her deep red evening gown was completely torn from the knees down, exposing 2 calves streaked with blood from thorns. She was barefoot, her high heels lost somewhere, her bare feet planted on the gravel path, the spaces between her toes filled with mud and blood. She saw my shadow cast against the window, her whole body trembling violently as if struck by lightning. Then she rushed toward the house. "Isabella, Isabella, come out, Lucian, Lucian, he." Her voice was cut short by the wind. The second half of her sentence was swallowed by the mournful whispers of the pine grove. But I was no longer at the window. I walked back to the study, bent down to pick up the high-heeled shoe lying on the floor, then picked up the other one. They were still there in the entryway, a fresh layer of dust covering their uppers. I slipped the shoes on, smoothed my disheveled hair with my fingers, and wiped the dried blood from my fingers with my sleeve. Then I walked out of the study, down the hallway, pulled open the front door, and stood at the top of the stone steps. And Servia was halfway up the stone steps. She must have taken a tumble. Her knee had struck the moss, covered marble scraping off a large patch of skin. Blood trickled down her calf, dripping onto the steps and turning black in the moonlight. She looked up at me, her delicate face streaked with tears and smeared with mud. Her mascara had run, leaving 2 dark smudges beneath her lower eyelids. Her lips were chapped, and a trickle of blood hung from the corner of her mouth. She didn't look like a flower that needed to be cradled in the palm of my hand. She looked like a fox with its leg caught in a hunter's trap. "Save him." She grabbed the hem of my skirt, her fingers clenched so tightly that the spaces between her nails were filled with mud and pine needles. "He's in the woods, that place. We don't know what that place is. He wouldn't let me follow. He pushed me away." And then that voice, "Slow down." My voice was calmer than I'd expected, so calm it sounded as if I were speaking to a lost mailman. "Where is Lucian?" She swallowed hard, her Adam's apple bobbing once, then again as if too many words were stuck in her throat, preventing her from speaking. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, a hint of clear, unvarnished fear finally shone in her emerald eyes. "He followed you out. After you got on the carriage, he grabbed the fastest horse from the stable, took no one with him, and rode north alone. I followed on another horse. I thought he was coming for you. I thought he was going to." She bit her lip, her teeth clattering against the gash, making her hiss in pain. "But he didn't take the main road. He rode into that forest, the biggest one to the north. He wouldn't let me follow, yelled at me to get back. His voice wasn't his at all. Isabella, there's something in that forest." My fingers tightened involuntarily. The moss on the stone balustrade was wet and slippery. My nails dug in, scraping off a small patch of cold, damp moss. The largest grove to the north. The Empire's northernmost expanse of primeval black pine forest, stretching from the old Bella estates all the way to the edge of the Ashburn family's hunting grounds. When I was a child, Father never let me go deep into that forest, saying there were miasmas, swamps, and man-eating beasts inside. But when I was 10, I got lost once and wandered where I shouldn't have. I saw ruins in a clearing built of stone, scorched by fire, and belonging to no known civilization. Be specific. What sound? What is it? And Servia let go of my skirt, collapsed onto the stone steps, and wrapped her arms around her shoulders, her whole body trembling like a withered leaf, lashed repeatedly by the autumn wind. Her voice seeped through her fingers, muffled and broken. Those ruins, the carvings on the stones, he's bleeding. Who's bleeding, Lucian? No, she snapped her head up, her eyes red as if they were about to burst. It's the stone. The stone is bleeding. I'm not lying to you. Isabella, I hate you, do you know that? I've hated you for 3 years. But I wouldn't lie to you about this. After he touched that stone, he started. His hands were covered in blood. And then he started calling your name over and over. And then he pushed me out here to find you, saying only you could. She couldn't go on. She was crying so hard her whole body was convulsing. That usual, refined, calculated, and flawless facade had completely crumbled in that moment. She was truly afraid, so afraid she couldn't even spare a thought for hating me. I looked down at her, at this woman who had monopolized my husband for 3 years, kneeling on the crumbling stone steps of my home, covered in blood and mud, crying and begging me to save him. Fate had stretched the scales of irony to their very limits. Why did you follow us? I asked her. The question had nothing to do with the immediate danger, but I simply had to ask. 3 years had passed. Some accounts had to be settled at some point. Even if settling them meant nothing more than asking a single question. She froze for a moment. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but her gaze had shifted, from fear to something deeper, something I wasn't sure I understood. She opened her mouth, her lips moving several times, before finally squeezing out. Because he said he had to find you tonight. He said if he didn't find you, he was finished. He didn't say upset or angry. He said finished. Lucian Ashburn has never used that word in his life. The wind suddenly stopped. The whole world fell silent for 3 seconds. That unnatural kind of silence. As if something enormous were holding its breath. Then a muffled thud came from deep within the pine forest. Not an explosion, not thunder, but a deeper rumbling sound, as if rising from the earth itself, traveling across the surface and causing the pebbles on the stone steps to tremble slightly. I made my decision. Not because I was soft-hearted, not because I still loved him, not because Ancelia's tears had moved me. It was because of that line in my father's letter. They took her blood. My mother's blood. The bloodline of the Bella family. If something in that grove was bleeding for Lucian, it was likely bleeding the secrets my family had buried for generations. And he was calling my name. I had to know the truth, even if the price was my own life. Stay here, I told Ancelia, lifting my skirt as I walked past her, down the stone steps, and into the waste, high thicket of wild grass. The moon was swallowed by a passing cloud, and the world grew 3 shades darker. I bent down and felt around on the ground until I found a fairly sturdy dead branch. I gripped it in my hand and weighed it. Not heavy, but sharp enough. A rustling sound came from behind me. And Servia hadn't stayed put. She stumbled after me, one hand pressed against the wound on her knee, the other clutching the torn hem of her skirt. Her bare feet stepping on gravel and twigs, every footprint trailing blood. She didn't speak, but the false, pitiful look had vanished from her eyes. In its place was an expression I believed she would never show to anyone else in her life. Guilt. She owed me. She clearly knew it, and this was the first time in 3 years she had admitted it. I didn't chase her away. I turned to face the dense, dark pine forest, clenched the branch in my hand, and took a step toward the low, lingering moan that still echoed in the air. By the time we dragged him into the living room of the old house, Lucian was barely conscious. His entire weight rested on my shoulders, and his scorching body heat radiated through his soaked shirt like a piece of iron just pulled from the fire. And Servia supported his arm on the other side, her bare feet leaving bloody footprints on the floor with every step. But the look on her face was no longer one of fear. It was something I couldn't quite put my finger on, as if she'd finally found an opportunity, not for atonement, but to unearth something she'd kept hidden for far too long. We laid Lucian down on the dust-covered sofa in the living room. The moment the back of his head touched the armrest, his entire body jerked violently, as if the memories etched into the stone tablets were still crawling through his veins. He opened his eyes briefly. His deep brown pupils were wide, his gaze drifting aimlessly over the cobwebs on the ceiling before settling on my face. His lips twitched, but no sound came out. Only a thin trickle of fresh blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. "I'll go get some water." Aunt Servia turned to leave. "Wait." I grabbed her wrist. The blood and dirt on my hands smeared onto the cuff of her long-worn, out deep red evening gown. In the moonlight, both our arms were crimson, and it was impossible to tell whose blood was more. "You didn't finish what you were saying in the woods." "The stone tablet. You knew it was there all along." "It wasn't a question." And Servia's wrist stiffened in my palm for a moment. Her eyelashes drooped, her honey-colored hair obscuring half her face. Then she slowly pulled herself free from my grip and took 2 steps back. She stood at the edge of the moonlight, in the center of the living room, obscured by the remnants of the curtains, her arms hanging at her sides, her fingers clenching and unclenching, unclenching and clenching. This went on for nearly 10 seconds. For a woman accustomed to controlling her expression with precision in every moment, this was the most complete collapse. "It wasn't me," she said, her voice soft. "It was my mother." The sound of the wind in the pine grove poured in through the broken back window, carrying the scent of pine resin mixed with blood. Lucian on the sofa let out a muffled groan, as if struggling in some distant, deep nightmare, and Servia lowered her head, staring at her scarred feet. She didn't look at anyone as she spoke, as if confessing to the dust on the floor. "My family name is Morven. The women of the Morven family have always been the Ashburns, not mistresses." Number, she bit the cracked skin on her lip. A drop of blood seeped out, and she licked it away quickly. "Watchers every generation. A woman is placed within the Ashburn household to watch over her, to ensure she bears no children." The living room fell silent for a full 3 seconds. My fingers clenched unconsciously, my nails digging 4 white lines into my palm. Not mistresses, watchers. It wasn't a defense. There was no hint of self-justification in the way she said it. It was the tone of someone speaking a family duty, ingrained in her blood and bottled up for decades. "Ensure who?" And Servia lifted her eyes to meet mine. Her emerald pupils contracted briefly in the moonlight. Then she spoke 2 words. "You." "Not me." I took a step forward, closing the distance to within an arm's length of her. My voice was so low it sounded foreign even to me. "Any woman who married into the Ashburn family 3 years ago. Anyone from the Bella family." The words caught in my throat, for the conclusion had already exploded in my mind. "Any woman carrying that bloodline." She nodded. "The Ashburns know of the monument's existence, but they don't know its trigger. They only know it must not be triggered. So every generation arranges for a woman from our Morven family to stand in that spot ahead of time." Her voice was as flat as if she were reading from a file, but her hand was trembling. It wasn't just her fingers quivering. Her entire hand, from wrist to fingertips, was shaking. The previous Duke, Lucian's father, changed the conditions on his deathbed. He told my mother that mere surveillance was no longer enough. What do you mean? Aunt Servia closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, tears welled up without warning. No sound, no sobbing, just two clear streams spilling from her eyes, trickling down her face over the dried blood and mud, carving out two clean trails of tears. He thought the Bella bloodline was too dangerous. The stone tablet had been passed down for centuries, and no one had ever activated it. But you're alive. You're a living carrier of the bloodline. As long as you remain in the Ashbourne household, someone could discover a way to activate it at any moment. His solution was to ensure you didn't survive. Lucian gasped sharply on the sofa. It was the kind of gasp one makes in the throes of extreme agony, as if something were lodged in his windpipe and he were struggling to break free. His fingers unconsciously clawed at the sofa cushion, his fingertips digging into the fabric seams, though he hadn't fully regained consciousness yet. He wanted me to kill you, Aunt Celia said. Tears were still streaming down her face, but her voice had steadied. Not to take you away from Lucian, but to get close to him, to become the person he cares about most, and to find an opportunity to eliminate you. My mother arranged every detail. The timing of my appearance in his social circle, the location, the song for our first dance, even the perfume they specially blended for me. That rose scent, you know it. I knew. For 3 years, that scent had always lingered at his collar. I'd always thought it was her scent, proof of her existence, her victory over me. Now it seems that scent wasn't hers. It was a weapon concocted decades ago by some older woman. Then, why didn't you kill me? Aunt Servia glanced at me. That look wasn't a plea for forgiveness, nor was it self-defense. It was more like that of a person who had lost completely, gathering the pieces of their own defeat. Because of Lucian, he wasn't part of the plan. The previous Duke thought pushing him onto me would give him leverage. But Lucian, she took a deep breath, roughly wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand, mixing blood and tears together. Lucian never had any feelings for me from start to finish. The man on the sofa shifted again. His eyes opened a slit, the bloodshot veins in the whites of his eyes as dense as a red spiderweb. He must have heard her last sentence, because the corner of his mouth twitched as if he wanted to say something, but all that came out was a muffled, stifled exhalation. Then go tell him to come after me. I turned to her, my voice tightening, not with sadness, not with sympathy, but with anger. The anger buried deepest in my chest, bottled up for too long, refusing to acknowledge anything. Why did you follow me here tonight? Wasn't your job to make me disappear? I'm gone. Your mission is complete. What the hell are you crying about? Aunt Servia flinched at my final outburst. Her back slammed against the edge of the fireplace, and the brass clock on the mantel, which had been silent for years, tick-tocked hoarsely as if some slumbering witness had finally been roused. She didn't look away from me. Tears were still falling, but in that moment, her eyes were strangely clear, clear to the point of cruelty. Because you're the first generation, she said, her voice so soft it seemed it might vanish at any moment. The Morven records make it clear. The Bella bloodline passes through the female line, not the male. The bearer of each generation automatically inherits the full power of the bloodline the moment the previous one dies. You were 7 the year your mother died. From that moment on, you were the only key. You are the weakest of your generation, and the most dangerous because you are so young. The previous Duke feared you, but to the monument, she paused, looking down at the dust on the floor. You are the one it has waited 20 years for. I had no choice. If neither of you can live, at least one must. This world must have one survivor. Her tears fell into the dust, leaving dark, circular stains. She didn't wipe them away. I didn't move either. The two of us stood in the living room of that dilapidated, dust-covered old mansion, nearly swallowed by the pine forest, one having hated her husband's other woman for 3 years, the other having lived for 3 years with the mission to kill the other. In the end, Neither of us had laid a hand on the other, and the man we'd placed between life and death suddenly spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd used every ounce of strength to pry his teeth apart. Every word was wrenched from the deepest recesses of his throat. "Could you two, please, stop speaking for me?" And Servia and I turned our heads at the same time. Lucian forced himself to sit up. His arms were still twitching uncontrollably, and his shirt was soaked through with blood, but his eyes were no longer unfocused. He looked at the two of us, not with the gaze of a husband looking at his wife, nor with the gaze of a lover looking at his mistress. It was the expression of a pawn, standing in the center of a chessboard, realizing for the first time that the pieces on either side were being manipulated by someone else. "I never loved her." He looked at Servia, his face showing no remorse or evasion as he spoke those words. Then he turned to me. The gash around his eye hadn't healed, and the blood at the corner of his mouth hadn't been wiped away, but his voice was terrifyingly steady. "Nor have I ever stopped loving you. I was." He coughed once, coughing up a dark red clot of blood, and turned his head to spit it onto the floor beside the sofa. Then he straightened up and finished his sentence. "I was drugged." And Servia's face turned deathly pale in that instant. It wasn't the panic of being exposed. It was something deeper, the bewilderment one feels when the precisely calculated weapon they take pride in is suddenly snatched from their hands. "What kind of drug?" "Not the kind you're thinking of." Lucian slowly raised his right hand, rolling his sleeve up from his wrist to his elbow. The gash on his arm, torn open by the power of the stone tablet, was still oozing blood. But below the wound, running from the inside of his elbow, lay an older, healed, pale white line. It looked like the mark left by countless needle pricks. It started the day after my father died, once every 7 days, injected here with a syringe. I thought it was vitamins. He told me it was a family tradition, that all Ashburn men had to take it. But that stuff made me unable to smell anything else, only roses. It made my mind fixated on seeing her face. I couldn't make out the faces of other women. "I couldn't make out your face." He looked at me, in the moonlight. His eyes were no longer that translucent amber color. They had returned to the deep brown I knew so well. The light within them was dull and heavy, like a ship's anchor that had been dragged ashore over 3 years and had finally come to rest. I stood before him, the fresh, dark red line at the base of my ring finger, pulsing with each beat, as if recording the rhythm of my heart. And Servia leaned against the fireplace, her hands covering her face. She wasn't crying. She was forcing every breath through her fingertips, preventing them from turning into screams. She didn't know. She truly didn't know. That plan, so cold and precise in her own words. That family mission her mother spoke of. From start to finish, it had merely used her beauty and jealousy as tools. She hadn't even realized she'd been drugged. No one spoke in the living room. Moonlight streamed in through the gap in the torn curtains, casting light on the 3 of them at the wrong angles, stretching shadows too long, illuminating wounds too brightly, and transforming the living room of this old mansion, which should have been shrouded in darkness, into a place where no one could lie to anyone anymore. The early morning chill poured in through the broken back window, sweeping away the last vestiges of warmth from the living room. The fireplace was cold. The hearth, untouched by fire for 3 years, was piled high with last year's withered leaves and the shriveled husk of a dead mouse. The 3 of us stood in the living room of this dilapidated old house, like 3 chess pieces swept off different boards and rolled into the same dusty corner. And Servia slid down to sit on the floor by the fireplace, her back against the cold brick wall, her blood-stained legs stretched out straight in front of her. She had stopped crying. The tears had dried on her face into 2 pale streaks of salt, shattering her delicate makeup into fragments. She looked up at Lucian, her eyes no longer holding the carefully calculated gleam I knew so well, only a woman who had been used as living bait by her own mother, speaking without a script for the first time amidst the ruins. "I thought I was going to be a mistress." Her voice was flat as if she were reading a file that had nothing to do with her. When I was 16, my mother took my hand and said, "You're going to do something very important. Get close to that young duke. Make him unable to live without you. And then, once he marries that girl from the Bella family." She even smiled when she said that, she said, "Then you'll keep an eye on her for us." She kicked the floor with her heel, her head hitting the wall with a dull thud. "Watch over." She used the word watch over, not kill, so I went with a clear conscience. I thought I was conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence, doing something that would make the family proud. And now you're telling me there was something mixed into my perfume. The stuff I put on my neck every day. She raised her hand, pressing her fingertips against the pulse at her neck, pressing down hard, as if trying to snap every blood vessel beneath her skin that had been saturated with the perfume. Was the trigger for his poison. Lucian didn't go over to comfort her, nor did he say a single word like, "It's not your fault." He simply stood beside the sofa, bent down, and picked up a tattered blanket that had fallen to the floor at some unknown time. One my mother had knitted, made of gray, blue wool, its edges eaten away by moths, shook the dust off it and handed it to Inservia. His movements were not gentle, nor did they carry any expression. But the moment she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders, the corner of his mouth twitched. The movement was so slight it barely counted as an expression. But in the 3 years I'd known him, I'd never seen that look when he was facing Anservia. It wasn't the way a man looks at a woman, it was the way an accomplice looks at another accomplice. A formula my father concocted. Lucian straightened up, his voice hoarse, but his logic terrifyingly clear, as if he'd compressed chaos into a solid fist, turned into perfume in your mother's hands. The two of them never let us meet alone. Every chance encounter was staged. Do you remember, the first time, at the Royal Opera House, your box number was just 1 digit different from my mother's. You wore a rose-colored dress, your hair pulled up high, and a pair of pearl earrings. I saw you in the hallway then, and my first thought was, a headache. And Servia finished his sentence. Wrapped in that tattered blanket, a faint, bitter smile touched her lips. You told me, in our 3rd year of knowing each other, you told me when you were drunk. You said that when you first saw me, it felt like someone had hit you on the back of the head with a hammer, but your feet were already walking toward me. You couldn't stop. Sitting in the corner of the sofa, I suddenly found the whole scene utterly absurd. I'd spent 3 years hating these two people, hating his coldness, hating her very existence, hating every intimate scene they'd acted out right in front of me. In the end, they were nothing more than 2 lab rats, drugged by the political schemes of the previous generation, locked into the same maze, with even their paths to the walls mapped out by others. So the two of you, I finally spoke up, my voice cracking slightly as it emerged from my throat. But I didn't care. One was drugged by his own father, the other by her own mother. You aren't in love. Each other's antidote. Aunt Servia finished for me. She buried her face in the blanket and let out a muffled chuckle, a sound less like laughter and more like a stifled sob. But an antidote is also a poison. The dose keeps getting higher. He'll grow more and more dependent on my perfume, and I'll grow more and more unable to live without his need for me. If no one stops us, the two of us will burn to ashes, Lucian said. His voice was soft, as if he were stating the conclusion of a long-proven experiment. After you left, when I pressed my hand against that stone tablet in the woods, I felt my blood surging out, yet my mind grew clearer and clearer. The moment that thing drew my blood out, I felt the spell break. It pushed me outward, flung my entire being out of my body and onto the ground. And then what I saw wasn't her. He turned his head to look at me. The bloodshot in his deep brown eyes hadn't yet faded, and a dark red scab had formed over the gash in his eyelid. But his gaze was steady, as steady as a ship that had finally found its anchor after being battered repeatedly by a storm. What I saw was you. And Servia lifted her head from the blanket, looked at Lucian, then at me. Her gaze bounced back and forth between Lucian and me 3 times. Then she suddenly stood up, clutched the tattered blanket tightly, and walked toward me, her bare feet pressed into the dust-covered floor, leaving a trail of blood with every step. She stood right in front of me, so close I could smell the lingering base notes of rose perfume on her. That scent, crafted to be a weapon, now reduced to a faint, almost imperceptible trail, nearly overwhelmed by the mingled smells of sweat, blood, and the earth of the pine forest. I met him when I was 17. By 20, I was his official mistress. At 22, I knelt on the stone steps of your house begging you to save him. She pulled the blanket from her shoulders and shoved it into my hands. I won't say I'm sorry anymore. Sorry doesn't help. I just want to tell you, tonight in the woods, he touched something he shouldn't have, and so did I. When that stone tablet summoned you, it also injected a bit of itself into my mind. Not much, but enough for me to sense one thing. What thing? It's afraid of you. Aunt Servia's emerald, green eyes stared straight into the depths of my pupils, without flinching, without pretense, and without a trace of performance. Whatever is sealed inside that stone, whatever it is, has been screaming ever since I touched it. Not a human voice, but I can understand it in my mind. It's afraid of you. It's saying, she's awake. Not he's awake, not that Lucian has awakened. It's you who's awake. A sudden gust of wind swept through the living room. Not the north wind pouring in through the broken window. The direction was wrong. This breeze rose from the floor, surging up from beneath the earth, seeping through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, passing through the dust and cobwebs, carrying an indescribable low hum. The brass clock on the mantelpiece was jolted by the wind. The hands clicked backward halfway around the dial, then stopped. The fresh, dark red line on my ring finger began to grow hot. It wasn't the searing, heart-wrenching pain of the woods, but a low fever, a persistent, rhythmic pulsation, as if a second heart had grown there, beating half a beat out of sync with my own. I glanced down. The red line hadn't spread. There was no bleeding, but it was extending toward the back of my hand, extremely slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was as thin as a strand of hair, but it was growing. Lucian saw it too. He strode over from the sofa, his steps still slightly unsteady. He'd lost too much blood, but he paid it no mind. He grabbed my left hand, turned it palm up, and pressed his thumb against the end of the red line for 3 seconds. It's moving up my arm. His voice was low, tinged with a fear I'd never heard before. Not the fear of facing an enemy on the battlefield, nor the fear of facing a political rival in the court, but the fear of watching something snatch a person right from his grasp. Isabella, what did you feel when you touched the stone tablet just now? Tell me the truth. Cody. My mom, I didn't pull my hand away. His thumb pressed against the back of my hand. The rough, warm, slightly trembling touch felt too real. So real that I couldn't lie in that moment. It wasn't seeing her. It was feeling her. She's inside the stone. It's not just me. It's many women, every generation of bearers from the Bella family. Their blood is all in there. They aren't screaming. They're waiting. They've been waiting for a long time. I looked up at him. How long have you known this? Lucian was silent for 3 seconds. During those 3 seconds, the moaning of the pine forest outside the window suddenly grew louder, as if something were moving toward the old house from the direction of the clearing. My father gave me a key before he died. He released my wrist and pulled a thin silver chain from around his neck, the one he'd worn close to his skin for years. I'd seen that chain countless times. Every time he'd unbuttoned his shirt over the past 3 years, it had been there. I'd assumed it was a dog tag or some sort of family heirloom. He pulled a silver pendant off the chain and pressed it into my hand. It wasn't a pendant. It was a tiny silver key. It was almost identical to the black iron key I'd found in the crack of the floor in my father's study. Same size, same shape, even the pattern engraved on the key's shank was the same. A snake biting its own tail and a Ouroboros. But this one was silver, new. no rust, no signs of wear from the passage of time. He said, when you encounter that thing you'd rather bleed than let go of, use this key to open the stone monument in the woods in the northwest corner. What's inside will give you the answer. He didn't tell me anything else. No mention of the Ballara family. No mention of bloodlines. No mention of the contract's terms. He told me to open it myself. Lucian withdrew his hand, coiled the silver chain into a ball, and pressed it into my palm, wrapped together with his little silver key. His voice came out through clenched teeth, every word tinged with the taste of blood. He told me to open it myself. He knew I'd meet you. He knew the stone tablet would scream your name with my blood. He calculated everything, including my pain and yours. The only thing he didn't account for was that you'd throw away that ring tonight. You threw away the ring, and you unlocked yourself. And Servia let out a laugh by the fireplace. A laugh that had been bottled up for so long it finally burst forth. It wasn't a happy laugh, but the kind of shattered laughter a pawn makes when it realizes the game is far bigger than it ever imagined. So the old man before him buried a dual key system, one hidden in the floor of Bella's house, the other hidden around his own son's neck. The one at Bella's was for Isabella. She'd find it sooner or later. The one at the Ashburns was meant for the monument. Lucian had to willingly bleed himself dry to unlock it, completely unaware of the truth. And I was the fuse, ensuring he wouldn't fall for the wrong person, ensuring the drug would lock him onto another woman before any genuine love could take root. And the result, he started acting strange the very first day she moved in. 3 years of medication, and it didn't do a damn thing. Just as she finished speaking, a loud crash suddenly echoed from outside the window. It wasn't thunder, nor the sound of a tree falling. It was the sound of stone shattering. It came from the direction of the clearing in the northern woods, sharp and abrupt, as if something had finally burst open from within. Lucian made his decision in a split second. He snatched the small silver key and its chain from my hand, clenched them in his own, and turned toward the door. His steps were still unsteady, his blood-depleted body protesting with every stride. But I saw his hand had already clenched into a fist, every knuckle turning white. "What are you doing?" I called after him. "To lock it." He glanced back at me. The cut on the corner of his mouth had split open again. A thin stream of blood trickled down his chin, dripping onto his already tattered white shirt. If the key my father gave me is part of the contract, then just as it has the power to open, it has the power to lock. It works in tandem. Since my blood opened it, my blood will close it. "You're crazy." And Servia scrambled to her feet, ignoring the blanket lying on the ground, and hobbled 2 steps after him on her injured leg. "It almost drained you dry just now. So you go." Lucian looked at me and shoved his silver key back into my hand. His hand was burning hot. His fingers wrapped around mine, pressing the small key into my palm with such force that my knuckles ached. "I'm not the one who's crazy. It's just the logic of it. It recognizes the Bella family's blood. It was only after Isabella touched the stone that the thing started to fear it. This key must be held by her and inserted into the back of the stone along with my key. It's a dual key system. My father would never let an Ashburn accomplish anything on their own. He was too cunning. He didn't say the word death aloud, but we both understood. Ashburn blood unlocks it. Bella blood locks it. Dual keys, dual bloodlines, a double safeguard. The old Duke still holds his final trump card in his grave. I took the key from his hand and clasped it together with the black iron key, hanging around my neck, the one I'd found in the old mansion and immediately strung on a chain. One black, one silver, one from the Bella family's floor trapdoor, one from the Ashbourne family's neck pendant. 2 snakes, 2 rings, 2 closed loops, drawn with the blood of generations from both families. "And Celia," I said, stopping at the doorway without turning back, "you said you're good at calculating." She gave a soft behind me, her voice as dry as if it had been sanded down. "Then help me figure out one thing. Where is your mother right now? A brief silence. Then Aunt Servia spoke the address in a voice completely stripped of all emotion. 14 Tulip Lane, south of the city. 3rd floor, the window with the dark green curtains. She won't run. She's never run from anything in her life. She believes everything is God's will. That's enough. I stepped over the threshold and into the coldest darkness of the early morning, with dry grass and gravel beneath my feet and a sky torn to shreds by tree branches overhead. Lucian walked beside me. His footsteps were heavy, each one driving gravel into the mud, but he didn't slow down. And Servia had caught up with us at some point, dragging her blood-stained bare feet, without saying another word. 3 hours ago, we were the Duke, the Duchess, and the Duke's mistress. Now we were a woman leading the way, clutching 2 keys, with some ancient bloodline awakening within her, a man covered in blood, finally emerging from the fog of drugs, and a woman who had cast aside all pretense, walking naked on a path where neither vengeance nor atonement offered a foothold. The creaking sound from the fissure by the stone tablet sounded again. This time it was longer, deeper, causing the ground beneath our feet to tremble slightly. On the distant horizon, the first faint pale layer of gray, blue began to appear. It would not be long before dawn broke, and we are walking into it. Not into the stone monument, but into that tower built from all the lies, starting from the bottom, dismantling it pillar by pillar.